Story 1. I live in northern Georgia, in a small town surrounded by dense forests and winding back roads. One night in late August, I was driving home from a friend's place. It was around 11 p.m., and the moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. But on these country roads, moonlight isn't enough. There are no streetlights out here, so my headlights were the only real illumination I had. I was about 20 minutes from home when things started to get weird. The road I was on is particularly isolated, cutting through a patch of old-growth forest. As I rounded a bend, I noticed something odd up ahead. At first, I thought it was just shadows playing tricks on me, but as I got closer, I realized there was something on the side of the road. Now we get all kinds of wildlife out here: deer, coyotes, even the occasional bear. But this was different. As I slowed down, I could make out a massive shape emerging from behind a tree. And when I say massive, I mean it was easily as tall as my car, maybe even taller. My first thought was that it must be a bear, but as it moved, I realized it was far too big, and its movements were all wrong. It seemed to be undulating, squirming. I can't really describe it, but it wasn't moving like any animal I've ever seen. I hit the brakes, my car crawling to a near stop about 50 yards away from this thing. My heart was pounding in my chest as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The shape was long, probably as long as my car, and I swear I could see what looked like spikes or quills along its back. For a moment, I considered turning around. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get the hell out of there. But I was only 20 minutes from home, and the idea of taking the hour-long detour on unfamiliar roads in the middle of the night seemed even more daunting. So against my better judgment, I decided to keep going. I figured I was in a car after all. Whatever this thing was, I should be safe inside my vehicle, right? God, I wish I'd turned around. I eased my foot off the brake and started creeping forward. As I got closer, the thing still hadn't moved from the side of the road. It was just writhing there, its form seeming to shift and change in the dim light. When I was about 30 yards away, I turned my steering wheel slightly, angling my headlights to get a better look. What I saw in that moment will haunt me for the rest of my life. The creature, if you can call it that, was like nothing I've ever seen before or since. Its body seemed to be constantly shifting, almost like it was made of thick, black oil. But it wasn't liquid, not really. It had form, but that form was always changing. One moment it looked almost serpentine, long and sinuous. The next it seemed to bunch up, becoming more compact and bulbous. The spikes I thought I'd seen earlier were there, but they weren't consistent. They would appear and disappear across its surface, like waves rippling over its body. But the worst part, the thing that still wakes me up in a cold sweat, was its face, or rather, faces. As it turned towards my approaching car, I saw not one, but multiple faces emerging from its writhing form. They weren't human faces, thank God, but they weren't animal either. They were wrong, distorted. Mouths filled with too many teeth, eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. I was paralyzed with fear, my foot hovering between the gas and the brake. I couldn't move, couldn't think. I just stared, horrified, as this monstrosity regarded my approaching vehicle. Then, just as I was about to pass it, the thing moved. It didn't lunge at me or attack. No, what it did was almost worse. It simply flowed off the road and into the forest. Its body seemed to elongate, stretching impossibly as it slithered between the trees, those terrible faces sinking back into its roiling mass. In a matter of seconds, it was gone, leaving no trace that it had ever been there. The whole encounter probably lasted less than a minute, but it felt like an eternity. I don't remember much of the drive home after that. I think I might have broken a few speed limits. All I know is that I didn't feel safe until I was locked inside my house, all the lights on, checking and rechecking that all the windows and doors were secure. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. For weeks afterwards, I couldn't bring myself to drive that road again, always taking the long way around. Even now, months later, I avoid it whenever possible. Story 2. It was late January, and I was driving back from a work conference in northern Michigan. The conference had run late, and by the time I hit the road, it was already past midnight. I wasn't too worried, though. I've always been a bit of a night owl, and I figured the empty roads would make for an easy drive. The first couple of hours were uneventful. The highway was almost deserted, just me and the occasional long-haul truck passing by. It was cold, around minus 15 degrees Celsius, 5 degrees Fahrenheit, and a light snow had started to fall. Nothing too heavy, just enough to dust the road and make everything look a bit ethereal in my headlights. I was about halfway home when things started to get weird. I just passed a sign saying the next town was about 30 miles ahead when I noticed something in my rearview mirror. At first I thought it was just snow swirling in my taillights, but as I watched, it seemed to coalesce into a shape, a human shape. I blinked hard and looked again. The shape was clearer now. It looked like a person running behind my car, but that was impossible. I was doing about 70 miles per hour on a highway in the middle of nowhere. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just an optical illusion caused by the snow in my tired eyes. But as I watched, the figure seemed to get closer. I could make out arms pumping, legs stretching in an unnaturally long stride. It was keeping pace with my car. My heart started racing. I pressed down on the accelerator, pushing my speed up to 80, then 90. I glanced at the mirror again. The figure was still there, still running, still getting closer. That's when I noticed something else. The thing chasing me, because I was sure now that something was chasing me, wasn't dressed for the weather. In fact, it barely seemed dressed at all. From what I could make out in the mirror, it looked like it was wearing nothing but underwear. I was properly freaking out now. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and I kept glancing between the road ahead and the mirror. The snowy highway stretched out endlessly in front of me, empty and dark, and behind me, that thing kept running. I don't know how long this went on. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to stretch and warp, marked only by my panicked breathing and the steady thrum of my engine. Then suddenly the figure was gone. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but the highway behind me was empty. Just snow and darkness. I slowed down, my heart still pounding. Had I imagined the whole thing? Was I so tired that I'd hallucinated some kind of pursuit? I was still trying to calm myself down when I saw something ahead. There was a figure on the side of the road, thumb out like they were hitching a ride. As I got closer, I realized with a jolt of horror that they were barely dressed, just underwear and what looked like a t-shirt. I knew I should keep driving. Everything in me screamed to floor it and get out of there. But he was almost blocking the road now. And maybe it was my morbid curiosity, or maybe some part of me needed to prove that what I'd seen in my mirror wasn't real. As I pulled up alongside the figure, I lowered my passenger window just a crack. The person, a man I realized, leaned down to look in. His skin was pale, almost blue with cold, and his eyes, I'll never forget those eyes. They reflected the light from my headlights like an animal's, glowing an eerie yellow-green. "Thanks for stopping," he said, his voice oddly calm for someone half-naked in a snowstorm. "I've been trying to catch up to you for miles." I didn't respond. I couldn't. I just stared, frozen in horror. The man's face split into a grin, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous. "Mind if I ride along?" he asked, reaching for the door handle. I don't remember consciously deciding to accelerate. One moment I was staring at that impossible grin. The next I was speeding down the highway, my engine roaring as I pushed it to its limits. I drove like that for hours, not daring to slow down, not even daring to look in my mirrors. By the time I got home, the sun was starting to rise. I've never been so glad to see daylight in my life. I tried to convince myself it was just a hallucination brought on by fatigue and the monotony of the road. But I know what I saw, what I experienced. I don't drive at night anymore if I can help it, and I never ever pick up hitchhikers. Some things are better left on the side of the road, no matter how human they might appear at first glance. Story 3. I've been meaning to share this story for a while now, but I've always hesitated because, well, it's pretty bizarre. It happened about 3 years ago, and I still get chills thinking about it. I guess it's time to finally put it out there. It was late October, and my two best friends and I decided to take a weekend trip to this small town in upstate New York. We'd heard about this amazing fall festival they have every year, with apple picking, hay rides, the whole 9 yards. Being city kids, we thought it'd be a nice change of pace. We left the city around 4 p.m. on Friday, figuring we'd get there in time for dinner. The drive started off normal enough. We were jamming to our road trip playlists, munching on snacks, and generally having a good time. As the sun started to set, we realized we might have taken a wrong turn somewhere. The GPS was acting up, probably because of the spotty cell service in the area. By the time it was fully dark, we were definitely lost. We'd been driving on this winding country road for what felt like hours. The trees on either side seemed to close in, their branches reaching over the road like gnarled fingers. It was unsettling, to say the least. Just as we were debating whether to turn back, we saw lights up ahead. As we got closer, we realized it was a small cluster of houses. We figured we could stop and ask for directions, maybe use someone's landline to call our hotel. But as we entered this little, I guess you'd call it a hamlet, things started to get weird. The first house we passed had all its lights on, but the curtains were drawn. What caught our attention, though, was the car in the driveway. It was an old station wagon, and all its doors were wide open. The hazard lights were flashing, casting an eerie red glow over the scene. "Okay, that's creepy," my friend Sarah said from the back seat. We slowed down, thinking maybe there had been some kind of emergency. But then we noticed the next house was exactly the same, and the next. Every single house had a car in the driveway, with all its doors open and hazards flashing. Some had their front doors standing open too, warm light spilling out onto empty porches. "Guys, I don't like this," I remember saying. "Maybe we should turn around." But Mike, who was driving, shook his head. "We need to find someone to give us directions. This place can't be completely empty." As we crept down the street, the fog started to roll in. It was thick and seemed to glow slightly in our headlights. That's when we saw the first person. It was a woman, standing stock still in the middle of the road, about 50 yards ahead of us. She was wearing a long white nightgown, and her dark hair hung in front of her face. She didn't move as we approached, didn't even seem to breathe. Mike slowed the car to a crawl. Should we ask her for help?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. Before anyone could answer, the woman's head snapped up. Even through the fog, we could see her eyes were completely black. She opened her mouth impossibly wide and let out a bone-chilling scream. Sarah screamed too, and Mike slammed on the brakes. The woman started running towards our car, her movements jerky and unnatural. In the rearview mirror, I saw more figures emerging from the fog behind us, all moving in that same terrifying way. "Go! Go! Go!" I yelled, and Mike floored it. We tore through the village, our hearts pounding. More of those things appeared on either side of the road, all screaming, all running towards us. Some were climbing out of the cars with the open doors. Others were pouring out of the houses. Just when we thought we were done for, we burst out of the fog and onto a clear stretch of road. Mike didn't slow down, and we didn't look back. We drove for maybe 10 minutes in terrified silence before we saw a pair of headlights up ahead. At first, we panicked, thinking it was more of those creatures. But as we got closer, we realized it was just a car parked on the side of the road. Mike slowed down, unsure whether to stop. That's when we saw a man standing next to the car waving us down. He was wearing a suit which seemed oddly out of place given our surroundings. Against our better judgment, we pulled over. The man approached our car, a strained smile on his face. "Are you folks okay? Did you come from Millbrook?" he asked, his voice unnaturally calm. We nodded, still too shaken to form coherent sentences. The man sighed, looking both relieved and something else. Annoyed? Worried? "I am so sorry about that. You weren't supposed to be able to get through. We're filming a horror movie back there, and things got a little out of hand with the special effects. Some of our extras got a bit too into character." We just stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. A movie? It didn't make sense, but it was better than the alternative. That's when Sarah noticed something. "There's someone in your car," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The man's smile tightened. "Oh, that's just one of our actors. They're resting." I peered at the car. Through the foggy window, I could make out a figure slumped in the passenger seat. They weren't moving. "Are they okay?" I asked, a chill running down my spine. The man's eyes hardened for a moment before his smile returned. "They're fine. Just tired after a long night of filming. Now I think it's best if you folks move along. We've got a lot of cleanup to do." Something in his tone made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. Mike put the car in gear, and we drove off, the man watching us in the rearview mirror until we turned a corner. We spent the rest of the weekend in a nearby town trying to calm our nerves. When we got home, we started looking for information about the movie. But there was nothing. No news about a horror film being shot in the area, no casting calls, nothing. Curious, we tried to find Millbrook on a map. It wasn't there. We drove back a month later in broad daylight, trying to retrace our route. But we never found that little cluster of houses. It was like the whole place had vanished. To this day, I don't know what we experienced that night. Was it really just an elaborate movie set? Or something else? Something that man in the suit was trying to cover up? All I know is that I still get chills when I think about that figure in the car. Were they really just an actor taking a nap? Or something else entirely? Story 4, I used to work second shift at a factory just outside of town. It was a decent job, paid well enough, but the hours were rough. I'd usually get off around 11:30 p.m., and most nights I'd head straight home. But this particular night, I decided to swing by my girlfriend Sarah's place first. It was a warm Alabama night, and Sarah and I spent a few hours just talking and enjoying each other's company. Around 2 a.m., I noticed dark clouds rolling in. The weather report had mentioned the possibility of thunderstorms, and it looked like they were about to hit. I decided it was time to head home. My dog, Max, has always been terrified of storms, and I hated the thought of him being alone and scared. There are two ways to get from Sarah's place to mine. One route goes through town, takes about 20 minutes. The other is this old dirt road that cuts through the woods. It's only about 8 minutes, but it's isolated. No streetlights, no houses, nothing but trees for a good 8-mile stretch. Usually I'd take the town route that late at night, but the storm was coming in fast. I figured I'd risk the dirt road to get home quicker. Big mistake. I was about halfway down the road when the rain started. Came down in sheets, so thick I could barely see past my headlights. The wind picked up too, and I could hear tree branches creaking and groaning all around me. I slowed down to a crawl, squinting through the windshield and gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. That's when I saw him. I came around a bend in the road, and there he was, a huge figure standing right in the middle of the path. My headlights caught him, and for a split second, I could make out some details. He was wearing a black hoodie with the hood up, dark pants, dark shoes. But what struck me most was his size. This guy was massive, well over 6 feet tall, and built like a linebacker. I slammed on the brakes, my tires skidding in the mud. For a moment, everything was still. Then he took a step towards my truck. Panic set in. I threw the truck into reverse, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. That's when he started running. Not away from me, but towards me. I don't remember much about the next few minutes. I know I backed up faster than I've ever driven in reverse, nearly fishtailing a couple of times. I remember seeing the guy disappear into the woods, but I didn't stop to see where he went. I just turned around as fast as I could and got the hell out of there. When I finally got home, I was shaking so bad I could barely get my key in the door. I tried to call the police, but my hands were trembling too much to dial. It took me a good 10 minutes to calm down enough to make the call. The cops took my statement, but I could tell they were skeptical. Probably thought I was some drunk kid seeing things. They said they'd look into it, but I didn't expect much to come of it. 2 days later, Sarah called me, her voice shaking. She'd just heard on the local news that a woman had a similar experience on the same road. Only in her case, the guy had actually tried to get into her car. The police were now taking it seriously, searching the woods and warning people to avoid the area at night. A week went by, then 2. The police found some kind of makeshift camp in the woods, but no sign of the guy. People in town started talking, coming up with all sorts of theories. Some said it was just a homeless person. Others whispered about escaped convicts or Bigfoot or even ghosts. I tried to put it behind me, convinced myself it was just some random weirdo who'd moved on. But then the dream started. Every night I'd find myself back on that road. The rain would be pouring down, and I'd see that figure in my headlights. But in my dreams, I couldn't move, couldn't drive away. I'd just sit there, frozen, as he got closer and closer. Sometimes I'd wake up just as he reached for the door handle. Other times the dream would continue and, well, let's just say those nights were worse. It's been months now, and things have mostly gone back to normal. The police never found the guy, and eventually the story faded from the local news. But I still can't bring myself to drive down that road, even in broad daylight. Story 5. My sister Lisa and I had just attended a music festival about 3 hours from our hometown. The festival had been a blast, but by the time it ended, we were exhausted. Lisa insisted she was okay to drive, so we hit the road around 1 a.m. About an hour into our journey home, disaster struck. Lisa must have dozed off for a split second because suddenly we were veering off the road. I remember the screech of tires, the crunch of metal, and then a moment of eerie silence. We'd hit a guardrail. Thankfully, neither of us was hurt beyond a few bruises. The car was dented, but still drivable. We were shaken up, though, and I insisted on taking over the driving. Lisa didn't argue. That's when things started to get weird. As we continued down the dark highway, I began to notice something strange in the fields alongside the road. At first, I thought it was just mist or fog, but as I looked closer, I realized the fog was shaped, human-shaped. These foggy, grayish figures seemed to be standing in the fields just watching us pass. They didn't move, didn't seem to have faces, but I could feel their presence. It was as if they were waiting for something. I tried to shake it off, tell myself it was just my imagination or the result of the shock from the accident. But they kept appearing, field after field, for miles. And then I felt it, a presence in the back seat. It was so strong that I could have sworn someone was sitting right behind me. But every time I checked the rearview mirror, the back seat was empty. I didn't say anything to Lisa. I figured she was asleep, and I didn't want to freak her out if it was just my mind playing tricks on me. So I drove on in silence, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, trying to ignore the foggy figures in the fields and the phantom passenger behind me. When we finally got home, I was so relieved I could have cried. I didn't mention any of it to Lisa, and we both went straight to bed. A few days later, Lisa brought up the accident. We were talking about how lucky we'd been when she suddenly went quiet. Then she asked me, "Did you see anything strange that night? After the accident?" My blood ran cold. I asked her what she meant, and she described exactly what I had seen. The foggy figures in the fields, the feeling of someone in the back seat. We were both freaked out, but also relieved in a way. At least we knew we weren't going crazy on our own. But that's not the end of the story. I wish it was, but there's more. About a week after our conversation, I was cleaning out the car. I reached into the back seat to grab some trash, and my hand brushed against something. It felt like fabric, but it was ice cold. I pulled it out, and it was a small, tattered piece of cloth. It looked old, really old, like something from another century. I showed it to Lisa, and she went pale. She said she'd never seen it before, and it definitely wasn't in the car before our trip. We decided to do some research on the area where we'd had the accident. What we found chilled us to the bone. Apparently, back in the 1800s, there had been a terrible tragedy in that exact spot. A group of travelers had been caught in a sudden fog and driven their wagon off the road. None of them survived. The article mentioned that locals sometimes report seeing strange, foggy figures in the fields near the accident site. And here's the kicker. It said that one of the victims, a young woman, was never found. The only trace of her was a piece of her dress, torn off in the accident, a piece of dress that matched exactly the scrap of fabric we'd found in our back seat. We haven't driven that road since, and we certainly haven't gone to any more late-night festivals. But sometimes when I'm alone in the car at night, I still get that feeling. Like someone's sitting right behind me, waiting, watching,